Good morning and welcome to this public meeting of the Standing Committee on Social Development. My name is Kieran Testard. I'm the MLA for Range Lake, filling in for Jane Whalen Armstrong as acting chair of the Standing Committee on Social Development. I'll now ask members in the room and online to introduce themselves for the record. We'll start with Ms. Morgan.
Good morning. I'm Shauna Morgan. I'm the MLA for Yellowknife North here in Yellowknife.
Mr. Narasu.
Good morning. My name is George Narasu. I'm the MLA for the Mackenzie Delta.
Thank
Good
you.
Good morning. I'm Cheryl Yakawaka. I am a member for the DECO. Thank you.
Thank you, members. Today we will receive a briefing on housing as a human right from Sarah Buhler, Associate Professor at the College of Law at the University of Saskatchewan. This is part of the committee's study on how NWT legislation and policies can incorporate housing as a human right. Please note, this meeting is being live streamed to the Assembly's social media channels. I'd like to remind all members and witnesses to direct all questions and comments to myself as chair and wait to be recognized before speaking to help us have a smooth meeting. We'll now pass it over to Ms. Buhler. Please introduce yourself and proceed with your presentation.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Can you hear me? Yes. Okay. So to introduce myself, my name is Sarah Buhler. I live and work in Saskatoon, Saskatchewan on Treaty 6 territory and the homeland of the Métis. I'm a faculty member at the College of Law at the University of Saskatchewan. My research focuses primarily on access to justice with a specific interest in housing and the law. And specifically within that, I'm interested in studying eviction from rental housing and how the legal system works around eviction. My research is focused on empirical research about the way that the eviction legal system works in Saskatchewan. But I also have projects and research that have maybe a more national scope. I work in collaboration on a couple of projects with the Canadian Centre for Housing Rights and the National Right to Housing Network. I've got a project right now that's looking specifically on how to work on preventing eviction of youth through the legal system. I have 3 kids. I've lived in Saskatoon and Winnipeg and Toronto. I've never been to the Northwest Territories, but would love to visit someday. So I was really thrilled to receive this invitation to meet with you today. I believe from what I've been learning about the work that you're doing that it is really leading the country in many ways, and I'm really interested and I'll be looking forward to following what you do in this work that you're embarking on. So I was given a pretty broad invitation in terms of a presentation. There wasn't any sort of specific topic that I was asked to look at. I'm sure as you've been learning and know already that the housing is a huge issue. And the human right to housing encompasses sort of many dimensions and dynamics. But I thought I would just focus in on the area that I'm most familiar with, and that is the area of eviction from rental housing and how it connects to the human right to housing. So we could move to the next slide. And I did put a few slides together. I'm hoping that what I have to share is helpful. I'm very aware that I am not deeply immersed in the context of housing issues in the Northwest Territories. So I'm speaking from my perspective and sort of what I understand and what I've learned from where I do my research. But I'm hoping maybe that some of these concepts might be of use as you embark upon your work. So just to start, eviction from rental housing engages issues relating to the human right to housing. As you've likely heard, international human rights laws set out standards relating to security of tenure and eviction. And I know from talking, I've done qualitative research where I've spoken to, and I'm involved in our legal clinic here in Saskatoon that does a lot of advocacy for tenants who faced eviction. And so I know from that work that the, 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 the experience of losing one's home in sort of a forced way, which happens with eviction, really implicates, it's tied up very deeply with human dignity, our deeply human need for home and shelter and well-being. We know how important and essential housing is to the exercise of our human rights. So the loss of that housing, you can see how it's wrapped up with sort of human rights ideas. Provincial and territorial governments can ensure and work to ensure that their eviction laws and related policies are incorporating and reflecting this idea that there's a human right to housing. So I thought I would just discuss two ways, two ideas that I've looked at in my own research, ways that territorial or provincial governments can actually look at trying to promote the right to housing through their laws about eviction and their policies related to eviction. One of them is enhanced legal aid for renters, and the second idea is incorporating what's called a proportionality requirement into the laws around eviction. So I'll just explain a little bit of background and what is behind these two ideas. So we could move to the next slide. Okay, so just a little bit of background. Evictions can be what we call formal, or they can be informal. My research and what I'm talking about here today is really focusing on formal evictions. And those are evictions that are enacted through engagement with the legal system. So it would be where there's orders, where the law is engaged, where landlords make applications, and that there's often a hearing, and there's orders that can be enforced. There are also informal evictions, and there's a lot of research out there that suggests that maybe the majority of evictions are actually informal in nature, meaning they never actually go through a legal process, and they can happen in different ways. A landlord can just threaten a tenant to leave, or they can lock them out, maybe illegally, or perhaps they can, in some cases, raise the rent to a point where it's just impossible for the tenant to stay, and there's actually no legal process involved, but the tenant feels in some ways that they're evicted because of that process, because of whatever actions or words of the landlord. But we need to focus on the formal system and make sure that it's working fairly, because what happens in the formal system really does influence informal evictions as well. Because, for example, if a tenant doesn't believe that the formal system will be there to protect them, they're more likely to just sort of go along with an informal eviction. So it's really matters what we set out in our laws and our policies in terms of eviction. Okay, so next slide. So just a bit of context. And this research, across Canada and really across North America has shown that when we're talking about evictions, they're almost always playing out in what I would call like a deeply uneven field. We know from research that tenants who already face multiple and intersecting forms of oppression or discrimination or marginalization are the tenants who are most vulnerable to eviction. So we know that, for example, youth, young people, young renters, also elders, tenants who have disabilities, young people, or people who have had histories of being involved in other systems like child welfare systems or correctional systems, who are already facing sort of compounding forms of disadvantage, also find themselves to be the groups that are most at risk of eviction. So it's not just sort of like all tenants are even sort of equally at risk of eviction. It's the most vulnerable who are experiencing eviction. Next slide. And there is actually a lot of research that you may or may not be aware of about the impacts of eviction. And this is research from sort of social sciences, health research, that explains and shows that evictions are often traumatic events for tenants. They have individual impacts on tenants who experience eviction. So eviction is associated with health impacts. So research that shows that people who are evicted have, in fact, higher rates of cardiovascular issues. They have poor maternal and child health outcomes. In fact, higher mortality rates. There was quite a bit of research during the COVID-19 pandemic showing that renters who were evicted during that period of time were more likely to be hospitalized or die of COVID. There's also negative mental health impacts of eviction. And tenants who are evicted tend to experience impacts to their educational outcomes and can lose employment. They can also risk losing their children because often housing is a prerequisite for having your children, and so children can be apprehended. And of course, we know homelessness can be an outcome of eviction, as well as involvement with other systems, like increased risk of criminalization, that kind of thing. But there's also research that shows that whole communities and neighborhoods can be impacted by high rates of eviction as well, because if there's a lot of turnover in certain neighborhoods, people having to leave right away, it affects community cohesion as well. So this is just a brief sort of background to show sort of how human rights are implicated by eviction and how eviction is a serious issue to pay attention to. So next slide. So international human rights law does set out some standards when it comes to eviction. Evictions are not prohibited under international human rights law, but there's different instruments and comments in international human rights law have set out some criteria, including the need for people affected by eviction to be meaningfully engaged and for there to be sort of like a fair legal process involved. There's this concept of proportionality, which I'll discuss in a minute. The idea that eviction should be a last resort and other alternatives should be explored. And there is the principle in international human rights law that evictions into homelessness are quote unquote a gross violation of the human right to housing. And we can move on to the next slide. So my first point, and I know I only have a few minutes left here, is that governments can consider thinking about enhancing legal assistance for renters who are facing eviction. Some people have said, that why would renters need lawyers or legal assistance in this area, because it's considered by some to be sort of an area of non-complex law. There's an accessible tribunal, that kind of thing. But Lauren Sawson has said that the rule of law is no less significant in an administrative hearing room than in a courtroom, and arguably it may be less so. Given the deeply consequential impacts of eviction, meaningful access to justice for renters is important. We can move on to the next slide. And I'll just, briefly say that because of that, there's often this power differential between landlords and tenants. Most landlords are, at least in my part of the country, in Saskatoon, most landlords undertaking eviction are large corporate landlords. I understand that there's many public subsidized landlords in the Northwest Territories, but those are also large institutional landlords. They're used to going forward and know the procedures and that kind of thing. There's research in other jurisdictions showing that landlords typically win in eviction matters. So the system works quite well for them typically. Next slide. But for tenants, most do not have a lot of sophistication or experience when it comes to engaging with legal processes. Most tenants in Canada don't have access to legal help or representation. I tried to do a little bit of research, and I understand that there's some legal information provided for renters in the Northwest Territory through legal aid. It's sort of, as far as I understand, tenants can get some access to legal information in some cases, but not a lot of assistance with the actual process. Now, what I understand is available in the Northwest Territories is actually is better than what a lot of jurisdictions have. But we do know, and this is from some research that I've done, is that tenants, even though the hearing process and the legal process is supposed to be accessible and easy to use, that tenants actually report that it's really confusing, intimidating, and they feel like the system is stacked against them in certain ways. So we can move on to the next slide. I also wanted to share that there is research out there. It's mostly American, but there's limited research in Canada as well that shows that tenants who have some of that sort of more holistic legal assistance actually has an impact on outcomes in evictions. And the reasons for that is, I've set them out on the slide here. In some ways, lawyers or advocates would understand the system. They would know the law, the procedure. They help to balance the power imbalances. They can actually, the presence of a legally trained person can deter meritless claims. And there's other benefits as well that tenants talk about. This idea of sort of that moral and emotional and logistical supports at a very stressful time, and also that legal assistance can help build the law and advance the right to housing. We know that the area landlord-tenant residential tenancies law is quite underdeveloped in Canada because lawyers aren't really generally appearing to sort of push ideas forward in terms of developing the law. Okay, we can move on. So one of my suggestions and ideas is that one thing that perhaps you could consider looking at is to think about what further legal aid sort of assistance could be provided to tenants who are facing eviction. I know that there's a new federal it's called the Blueprint for a Renter's Bill of Rights that you might be aware of, that was released a couple of weeks ago. It does call on provinces and territories to look at their legal aid systems to, quote, even the playing field for renters. And that's going to be attached to federal housing funding. So it might be worth looking at as well. And I believe that funding should really work to support legal assistance that are immersed in the realities and contexts of local communities that can assist tenants in a meaningful way. I know I only have about 2 minutes left, but I will move on to the next slide. And this is the second idea I wanted to talk about, and that is to consider what inserting what we would call a proportionality framework would mean for eviction legislation. And this comes from international human rights law. It refers to an idea that this idea that eviction should be seen as sort of a last resort, that all alternatives to eviction should be considered, and there's some sort of frameworks that are set out here. And the key idea is that the consequences of eviction, which, as I've set out, can be a really serious consequence for a tenant that implicates their human right to housing, that must be proportionate to the objective of the eviction. It means in practice that adjudicators who are considering eviction must look at all the circumstances of the cases, including things like, the best interest of children involved, that kind of thing. We can move on to the next slide. So as I said, this comes from the international human rights framework around eviction. We can move on to the next slide. And I wanted to note that the federal blueprint for the Renters' Bill of Rights that was just released recently also talks about the idea of proportionality and urging provinces and territories to consider adopting, quote, measures that promote or require proportionality in renting practices. This means that actions affecting renters, such as evictions, consider factors like timing and fairness. This is important for renters with fixed incomes, living with disabilities or complex medical needs, or for families with school-aged children as well. We can move on to the next slide. So we can talk more about proportionality. I did spend a little bit of time looking at some of the Northwest Territories eviction jurisprudence. And I have to say that I believe that the adjudicators in your rentals office they are looking at, they are not, from the decisions I looked at, are not necessarily evicting tenants right away. They are looking at alternatives and payment plans and that kind of thing. What I saw missing from some of the decisions I looked at is sort of an explicit consideration of tenants' circumstances and thinking specifically about, if this tenant loses their housing, will they be homeless, for example, and sort of what's the plan going forward. But those are some of my thoughts. I hope that's helpful, and I look forward to any questions and discussion and learning more about your work.
Thank you, Ms. Buhler. I will note that Ms. Whalen Armstrong has joined us. If you want to introduce yourself for the record.
Thank you. I do apologize for signing in late. My name is Jane Whalen Armstrong, MLA for Mofi in Plateau Region. And the presentation, well, maybe I'll just start with the presentation that you just presented. There's a lot of information in there, about the tenants' right. I think that's where we're at right now, is that we're here because of them, that, and we have a lot of homeless issues in the Northwest Territories. We shouldn't, with the 40,000 people here, we shouldn't have a major issue, but we do have an issue. So your presentation, it gives me a lot of, there's a lot of information in there that maybe we can use to move forward. And some of the stuff that, to amend the legislation that you mentioned. So it's something, there's a lot of things in there. There's a lot of good things in there that maybe we can take into consideration moving forward, because we're here for the people, and we want to make things better for the people out there. And the majority of the population in the Northwest Territories is the Indigenous people. So we have to keep that in mind always. And I'm sure it's not just us, it's also the other Indigenous leaders as well that also have, concern about the homelessness. And so like you, we all know we never had an issue with homeless before, we're the First Nation here. And then so, we never really had an issue So now it has become an issue because of the housing policy that's in place. And it's not just the public tenant, it's the things that I really do have problem with is the mortgage, the housing NWT mortgage. I'm surprised you didn't mention that because we do have housing NWT or housing corporation. That's what it used to be. They, I mean, what they're going promoting more of a homeowner than going into a public rent public unit. I think they should have went that way, providing more public home ownership programs. But I guess because of the policy, because of the funding that was given from Ottawa, so maybe the hands were tied. I'm not too sure, but I think we missed the boat where we should have just continued focusing on home ownership program. Because even in the past year in my region alone, I think there are some people that were under the NWT mortgage, housing mortgage, through the government of the Northwest Territories housing program. They got evicted. They lost their house, but that's through the GNWT. Why? And then, but with the financial institution, you have no choice. With the banks, if they foreclose on you, then you have no choice. But it's not like that with the GNWT, and then I think they should have done more to accommodate our people. Because of that, I know in my region there's like a family of 7 or 8. There's 2 that I know of that became homeless. Now they're living in an overcrowding situation. And that's from that mortgage, that NWT housing mortgage, and easily sold those units for cheap, for at a cost, very low. I guess we don't have market, so the housing doesn't go for 200,000-300,000 around here. We don't have the housing market. So I think the government should have just took care of that, but they didn't. So that's why we're here right now. And I really do enjoy your presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Whalen Armstrong. Ms. Buhler, did you want to comment?
No, well, just thank you for those comments. I have so much to learn about housing in your territory. Certainly, I don't focus on mortgages or home ownership per se, but I agree with you that losing homes through foreclosure, it's also a form of it's also an eviction, right? And a loss of housing. So. And I do think that all those issues sort of underlying one of the most common reasons for eviction from rental housing, and I looked, again, I'm not an expert at all in Northwest Territories law or residential tenancies decisions, but I did look through some of them, and it seems clear to me that one of the most common reasons why tenants are being evicted, it's because of rental arrears, even from public housing, that they're struggling for different reasons to pay their rent, and so there's underlying issues in terms of just making it possible for people to afford their rent and pay their rent and afford their housing and have that security of tenure. So thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Buhler. Committee, I will turn to members to see if they have questions. Ms. Morgan?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And thank you, Ms. Buhler, very much for taking the time to share with us today. This is super helpful. One thing I wanted to ask for clarification on, so you talked about how the tribunal or the the legislation should incorporate consideration of circumstances and whether or not the person might become homeless, and you talked about evictions into homelessness. How do you determine whether or not someone will be evicted into homelessness? Is that determined like by vacancy rates, or just the person fearing or not knowing where else they might go? Or like, how does an independent, arbitrator or legislator or someone decide whether or not someone is destined to be homeless if they get evicted?
Thank you, Ms. Morgan. Ms. Buhler?
Thanks. That's a great question. So I think that in any case, it would be case by case. It would be an individualized determination by the hearing officer if it's something that's being considered in a hearing. I would think that it would, it would be evidence that would be brought forward by the tenant. I'm guessing it would have to do with the availability of other adequate, appropriate housing and the ability of the tenant to access that. I know that in many jurisdictions, and from the little bit of reading that I've done about your territory as well, that tenants who have histories of eviction, or if they have a lot of rental arrears, for example, and they're evicted because of that, and then they can't, they have a huge debt, right? They also, I believe that landlords have processes for sharing information about tenants that maybe that they're not able to access other housing if they have of that kind of situation. Tenants are also, landlords might do look at other factors in terms of being willing to rent to certain people. So I think it's really an individual determination. And I think that it's not, maybe the focus is not just on whether the person will be homeless if evicted, but also are there ways to maintain the housing, have an alternate plan. And I did see that in some of the decisions that I looked at, that they're looking at payment plans, and being willing to take on that kind of thing. So looking at sort of all reasonable alternatives to allowing someone to maintain their housing. But again, I do want to emphasize, I didn't really have a chance to do this in the presentation, that really what's also important, and I know that this is part of the work that you're doing, is looking at those broader systemic issues, like making sure that housing is affordable, making sure that tenants have enough resources to pay for their housing. That would be the first step to preventing situations where tenants get into arrears and face eviction because of that. I'm not sure if that answers your question, but I hope that's helpful.
Thank you, Ms. Buhler. Ms. Morgan?
Yeah, thanks for that. It does make sense, and it sounds like the burden would be on the tenant to bring forward evidence that would be convincing to an officer. But those are some good suggestions of if you can show evidence of debt or rental arrears, or around here sometimes there's, I don't know if it's formal or informal, sort of blacklisting of tenants from some of the largest landlords. So that would certainly have a big impact on someone's ability to get other rental housing. I guess one question that does come up, though, and you haven't touched on it, I'm not sure if you look at it, but I mean, there are tenants that are evicted because of like violent behaviors or drug dealing or other things that are endangering others around them in the rental housing. But the problem is often there are not necessarily other good places for that person to go. They may go into the shelter system, which is also not necessarily a safe place for anyone. So do you have suggestions or thoughts on what should be done with people who are causing sort of danger or threat or to the people around them, but yet they also need safe housing themselves? Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Ms. Buhler.
Yes, I have thought a lot about this, and I think it's a great question. It is a very, very difficult situation. I have talked to tenants who's been in situations where their neighbors, where they're witnessing a lot of violence or, damage and that kind of thing. So I'm very sensitive to the need for everyone. Everyone has the right to safe housing, and that includes neighbors, right, in a building or a complex, that kind of thing. But as you state, it's very difficult because when someone is evicted, that person doesn't disappear. That person needs to find housing somewhere else, and perhaps they become homeless, and that becomes a very difficult and maybe unsafe situation for them and others, or they move to another place, which may be even less safe, and less secure. So, and there is a little bit of research, not in Canada that I'm aware of, but in the United States, that shows that eviction for illegal activity actually ends up not making those buildings safer. It might feel like a quick solution, but may not have long-term impact. So again, I'm not sure about research in Canada about that, but I think it is a very difficult situation. I think that it's still important, though, to have a careful process that's fair to the tenants. The research, I actually did a research project focusing on Saskatchewan decisions with those exact circumstances. So evictions for illegal and dangerous tenant behavior. In Saskatchewan, tenants can face immediate eviction for any kind of illegal or dangerous types of behavior. And I looked at about 300 decisions in our jurisdiction. One of the things that I saw is often just sort of this very quick eviction process where not a lot of evidence had to go forward before someone was facing eviction. And there's some problems with that, because one of the things that I saw, for example, is that tenants who were victims of violence, so victims of, for example, domestic violence, were facing eviction for violence, but it wasn't them who was causing the violence, but they were evicted because they were one of the tenants in the unit, for example. So to me, that is a problem that should at least be considered when we look at that. I also saw that in many cases, other cases that I looked at, people were evicted because of actions of police. So, for example, in more than one of the cases I looked at in Saskatchewan, the tenant was evicted after the police or RCMP had come in and done sort of like a raid in the unit and broken a door down for some reason. And then the tenant was evicted because of the damage to the unit, but the police had caused. And in some of those cases, the police or the tenant was actually, the police had made a mistake, or they ended up not pursuing charges, that kind of thing. So I think it's worth looking really carefully at, the standard of proof, the way that decision makers are looking at evidence about tenant behavior. That's not to say, and I'm not trying to minimize, how complex and difficult this issue is. And I'm sorry, I don't have a real answer to it. But I know that it's incredibly difficult. But at the very least, I think looking at sort of making sure that that those processes are also fair, and that it's not just sort of like, oh, well, there's been some sort of violence in the unit, like those tenants need to go, because there's often there's also often some complicated stories and realities behind some of those. So that's maybe some of what I can offer there.
Thank you, Ms. Buhler. To that point, the territorial government has contemplated safer communities and neighborhoods legislation, otherwise known as SCAN. The purpose of SCAN is essentially to do what I think the environment you just described in Saskatchewan, where there are people who are engaged in criminal behavior in units, can be more easily evicted. So, how would you place legislation like that in the context of a regime that's underpinned by housing as a human right? Like, is SCAN legislation compatible with that concept of housing as a human right? Ms. Buhler.
That is also an excellent question. You probably are you aware of the recent, there's a court decision out of the Yukon just recently looking at the constitutionality of their SCAN legislative regime. And I think that decision would be very much worth studying and looking at. The judge in that case looked at how the SCAN system there and the sort of quick eviction processes permitted under that act violated Section 7, the security of the person section of the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, and wasn't justified. And so it would be worth looking at that. I think that decision, and from the research that I've done looking at the way SCAN operates in Saskatchewan, there's definitely a lot to do to improve those processes from a human rights perspective, absolutely. And so if you are looking at implementing that type of legislation, I think looking at the recent court decision from the Yukon and really thinking about sort of the fallout that can happen from those types of processes. I know, the case in the Yukon involved a mother with a bunch of children who ended up being evicted because of the operation of the SCAN investigation. I know that our legal clinic that I'm involved with here in Saskatoon has represented clients who were absolutely not involved in any illegal activity, but got sort of swept up in these processes with not a lot of notice or due process, or even sometimes the ability to actually participate in the hearing, which is really problematic. So definitely would recommend, doing some study about that for sure.
Thank you, Ms. Buhler. Mr. Nersu, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you for your presentation. My comments are around eviction, reasons for eviction. Within my community of Fort McPherson, we have high unemployment rates. And most of our employment people that are employed is on a seasonal basis, and their rent is based on their income tax. So once they do work possibly 6 months, then they do their income tax, then in the new year their taxes their rent is adjusted based on their income tax, and they're not working for the next 6 months. So they have to pay this, say, $700 or whatever it may be based on their income tax, and they fall into arrears. And these are not minimal amounts, but they're huge arrears that they can't pay because they're maybe on what they call employment insurance of some sort. So they're not able to pay their income tax for the 6 months when they're not working. And I believe the rent scale needs to be revised in the NWT where it reflects this. I think at one time they used to do it on a monthly basis, where they would bring in their, if they're working, they would bring in their pay stubs and adjust their rents accordingly. But now they're using, I don't know if it's throughout the NWT or each individual community that is using this rent scale, but something has to be, the rent scale needs to be revised so that our tenants are not getting into big arrears and or being evicted, because I've been contacted by a few members of my constituents saying that they're facing eviction. So I have to intervene and try to help them out as best I could. Some are ongoing, but some have been resolved. And the scan legislation too. I was aware of the Yukon courts, their decision, and we were going in looking at some sort of legislation in regards to scan, but there is a lot of illegal activity within our I have to use my community. I'm not assuming anybody else, but in my community we have a lot of people with activity, doing activity, legal activity within the units. And when they sign their rental agreement, it states that if they're found conducting illegal activity within public housing units, they will be evicted. But I haven't seen that implemented. But they're saying their hands are tied, and they have to give them 24 hours notice if they want to go search their house because somebody's complaining that there's illegal activity. And I'm just wondering too, how much authority does the board, local housing authority boards have? Because I've heard that the local housing authority in my community, they make recommendations, they make decisions on who they feel should be put into homes. Because right now we have six units that are empty, and the local housing association or authority here in Fort McPherson is not doing anything to place families that are in need. They're livable. I saw them working on these houses, but they're still empty. And it's getting colder up here at the present time. And I questioned this with the housing, and they're saying they're waiting for the next board meeting. But I've also heard that once the board makes a decision, their recommendations or decisions are not being implemented. And the arrears, you talked about that was your main topic, and I'd like to see something done on with the rent scale being revised. I don't know, like I stated, I don't know if the whole NWT that's this rent scale is being used, but I know it's being used in Fort McPherson, and there's a lot of complaints saying that it should be revised and go back to the monthly checks where you bring in your check stub and they do your calculations from there. Just more of a comment than anything. I'd just like to thank you for your presentation. Thank you.
Ms. Buhler?
Thank you for those comments. I learned a lot. I think that it sounds like there's definitely some policy improvements that can be made, and that you've identified those. So thanks for those comments.
Thank you. Committee, anything further from members? Oh, Ms. Yakalaya.
Good morning, committee. Thank you, Ms. Buhler, for your presentation. Very interesting how that all plays out. The question I have is, in your opinion, how do we go about or create a workable solutions to prevent evictions? Thank you. That's one question. Thank you.
Sorry, I'm stepping in as the replacement for the replacement here. Ms. Buhler, do you have a response?
Sure, that's such a huge question. How do we go about, what can we do to prevent evictions? I feel like I'm spending my whole career trying to study that and trying to understand and figure out how to do that. And I know that so many people are working on that question as well. I think that, what I'm offering here is a couple of ideas that could help prevent evictions, that could be sort of added to the legislation or added to sort of policy about, legal aid and legal assistance for tenants. But really, really at the end of the day, and I think from what I understand, what's needed is to try to work towards a society where everyone has affordable, adequate housing to meet their needs, to meet the needs of their families, to feel safe and secure. And that, if you can afford to pay your rent, that arrears, as we've talked about, is one of the biggest reasons for eviction. That would be a huge thing right there if we could ensure that people are able to pay their rent. And then, of course, that would involve looking at all the sort of reasons why people get into situations where they cannot afford their rent. When you look at the research, there's so many reasons, including, people losing their jobs, or what we just heard about, seasonal employment, where, the jobs are only available for part of the year. People also get sick, or are hospitalized, those kinds of things, or have other types of health or addictions issues that cause that. And we also talked about, some of the issues to do with, addictions or violence, or other types of issues that people might have that also might lead to eviction application. And again, those are complex issues. So really, it kind of all, to me, goes down to addressing sort of the root underlying causes, underlying evictions, but also there are some things that can be done to support tenants in the meantime. But that is a really huge question, and I'll be working on trying to answer that for many years, I think.
Thank you. Ms. Diakolai, do you have a follow-up?
Yes, I do. Thank you for that. It's a very complex issue, but it's good to hear someone that has some knowledge speak to it. The other question I have is, well, I'm going to ask you for your thoughts. What are your thoughts on processes such as evictions being addressed locally rather than follow a national standard? Thank you.
Ms. Buhler?
That's a great question as well. I think that, so locally, every province and every territory, it's their constitutional jurisdiction to make the laws around housing and eviction. And I think that, at the end of the day, there has to be that local sort of knowledge informing the approaches that are most appropriate. I think the federal blueprint for renters' rights that I mentioned is it's not extremely prescriptive. It's kind of like a one-page document that sets out some of these principles that are derived from international human rights law, as I mentioned. But I think there's quite a bit of room for jurisdictions to look at those ideas and know that they come from, years of advocacy by housing advocates, and they're brought into international human rights law principles, and then think about sort of how could that look in the local jurisdiction. But I do think that those broad frameworks can be helpful, and then you can kind of think about like, well, what does it look like here, and what's most important in this jurisdiction. I don't think a top-down approach necessarily usually works the best. It has to have sort of the engagement of local communities. So I hope that answers your question.
Thank you, Ms. Buhler. Do any other committee members have more questions for our presenter? Mr. Hawkins, you're online.
Yeah, thank you. If you can hear me okay, hopefully. I just wanted to say I came in late. I was tied up with another meeting, but I'm following this topic very closely. I think it's very near and dear, and no matter where you are on the spectrum of the sense of administration, I mean, you still can't deny people's ability that they must live somewhere. And if we're not helping them on one side of the problem, we're going to certainly help them on the other side of the problem. So we can avoid some of these challenges in many ways, but the problem is we're not really avoiding them. We're just kicking them onto somebody else's plate. So it's challenging, and I can appreciate, I can feel your sincerity through your voice. This topic is very passionate for many people, and I want to recognize that. So I want to thank you for your thoughts. And again, I had to be late because I was tied up with another initiative, but I am following it very closely, and it's a meaningful one. And like I say, as I finish off here, even the most strong or stringent people in the sense of frustration still recognize people need to go somewhere, and that isn't lost on them. And so sometimes dealing with the complexities of those who are difficult to house, we also have to help those who are in the administration side of the process understand, build empathy, help them with avenues to find other solutions as well, and maybe I'll say, and lastly, is not to abandon people through this process, because we've all gone through our swirling down the drain, in our own way, in our own times, and some are way more difficult than others, and sometimes just a little help changes the direction of everything. So anyway, thank you very much. Appreciated your time, and I just wanted to let you know that I'm grateful for your thoughts. Thank you.
Thank you. Did that spark any new thoughts or responses, Ms. Buhler?
Your thoughts exactly echo my thoughts, so thank you so much for those comments.
So I don't see any new hands up. I did have one final question, which you've suggested that we could improve our legislation by incorporating a sense of proportionality, or that the officers would have to consider the circumstances of the person and whether they might be going into homelessness, or the impacts on children, things like that. Are there examples of legislation in other jurisdictions in Canada where that's already been incorporated that you can point us to in terms of a best practice legislation? Ms. Buhler?
Great question. So no, there's no jurisdiction in Canada that has incorporated this kind of proportionality analysis into their legislation. Now, there are certain jurisdictions, and actually the Northwest Territories is one of them, that in your legislation, it already allows adjudicators to make orders other than eviction. So it's not like, as soon as someone's in arrears, they're automatically evicted. There are jurisdictions in Canada that are more in that sort of category. Your jurisdiction is already ahead of the game by allowing I believe the language in your legislation says, that adjudicator has to decide if it's justified. So there is that language saying, is eviction justified? And so there's already sort of this idea, I would say, in the legislation that they're still supposed to look at the fairness, but it's not laid out explicitly, and there's not a framework set out explicitly. So no other jurisdiction has this proportionality framework, informed by international human rights law in their legislation. So certainly you could lead the country. I know that there are jurisdictions, so in Europe, and I'm not an expert in this area, but that European countries have this proportionality framework in their eviction legislation. So there are examples elsewhere in the world where this approach is in place. But certainly, I think what would be helpful is it would also just remind adjudicators. And I think it's, when we look at residential tenancies legislation, if you've spent a lot of time, maybe you haven't, reading those acts, it often is, they're it's legislation's kind of dry, but you never, if you were an alien from outer space coming in and reading this act, you would never know that it's really concerning something that's implicating people's human rights. It looks like it's kind of very contractual, like it's just transactional. You're paying your rent, there's consequences, those kinds of things. So I think putting into the legislation this understanding that it's implicating human rights could perhaps go a long way.
Thank you for that. That gives us some insights into where we can go with this. Final question, your other suggestion about providing more legal supports, assistance or legal aid, or sort of beefing up what legal aid can offer tenants who might be facing eviction. I think you are recommending, it sounds like, that the federal government put more money nationally into legal aid programs, but then it sounds like maybe the Renters' Bill of Rights is recommending that provincial and territorial governments put more resources into legal aid. Is there any consensus nationally on which level of government is more responsible for, paying for legal aid or adding to those resources to ensure people's right to housing is protected? Ms. Buhler?
Thank you. So for legal aid with relating to civil matters like housing, my understanding is that the federal government has funding for legal aid. That's there's transfers to provinces that provinces then can use to fund and assist with their legal aid systems. I actually don't know the exact mechanics of how civil legal aid is actually funded in every jurisdiction. But my understanding is, at least with this new renters bill, blueprint for a renters bill of rights that talks about legal assistance for renters, I believe that it's going to be tied with funding packages. So I don't know exactly, but I'm guessing that there may be some funding, and I know that there already has been some funding announced for legal assistance types of programs by the federal government. So I'm guessing, hopefully, that there will be some funding. I know that it's expensive to fund legal aid, and I think that there's I don't know if there's a consensus across provinces, but I think historically there's been contributions by the federal government for legal aid.
Okay, thank you very much for that. Now, I don't see any further questions from committee, and we've certainly had a very informative session so far. And so I want to thank everyone for joining us today, and this will conclude today's public briefing on housing as a human right. So the public proceedings have now concluded. Thank you very much.
Thank you.